I'm Matt.
And I'm Nate.
And this is Not Quite Religious, a podcast where a Christian pastor and former evangelical turned atheist have conversations about faith, religion, philosophy, and life while drinking coffee.
Welcome to episode 38, where we're going to kind of pull off of last episode and continue our conversation on ethics, maybe morality, philosophy, and why I think ethics is sort of BS.
Ethics? I thought we were saying philosophy.
Well, I wrap ethics into philosophy. And not ethics like something's ethical, but, the metaphysical...
Well, that was a curveball for me, and that's way more interesting that you would think ethics is BS.
Yeah. But first, we're finally back in person together again.
It feels good.
After a month, so that's nice. We're sitting on opposite sides that we normally sit on, though, so I don't know how I...
Is that... Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually you're to my right.
Yeah. So
that's true. In terms of actual geography, though, you're still on the same side. You know what I mean? Like, whatever. I think that's north.
Oh, yeah.
But we just we're facing different.
We're going to have to take a picture and post it on Insta so that people know what the heck we're talking about.
Yeah. So the coffee that we're drinking today, Nate provided. And it's Share, once again. I think this is probably the third time we had Share coffee.
I think it's the second.
Second time?
Yeah.
And it's the Colombia. Oh, that's cool. You don't see a lot of like Colombian. I may have said this before. You don't see a lot of Colombian just by itself. So whenever I do, I'm like, oh, that's neat. And sometimes it's never bad.
Yeah.
But the thing with Colombia is like it's so middle of the road that it's usually used in blends.
Yeah. So this is their comfort. That's what they name it.
Okay.
Before we had adventure.
And the description is apple pie, vanilla, and brown sugar, which is good. It's not happiness.
It's true. I think happiness was only on that one. Maybe they heard us. And then all the others have been very...
Yeah. Because I know what those things are. I know what apple pie and vanilla and brown sugar are. I'm not even a master chef like yourself. But actually, I haven't even taken a sip yet, so let me do that real quick. Solid 8.5.
Yeah, I would say it's an 8. I like their other blend better.
Yeah.
But I went on a limb because I'm like, we need a new coffee. And,
yeah. I'm glad you said 8 because I was feeling weird about giving Share an 8. But I think it's...
You mean the last time?
I think it is closer to an 8.
Yeah, all right. See, their other blend is... I don't know, it's my favorite. But you gotta...
Yeah.
You gotta adventure, man, right?
Yeah, you gotta... If I see a Colombia, I always get it, just out of sheer curiosity.
I mean, it's not bad.
4 times out of 5, I'm like, eh. But every once in a while, it's great, and then it's a really nice feeling. You're like, oh. And I'm sure in other connoisseur ships, like wine or whatever, you have like the same kind of thing where it's like, there's probably some white wine out there that's like usually basic, but sometimes somebody makes it really good.
I think that's what a cab is.
Yeah.
And not... So, a Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yeah.
Right? But, like, when you actually move to, like, a Cab Franc or a Pinot, you're like, oh, man. Like, cabs are okay. Like, I'll go... Like, if I'm at a wedding...
Yeah.
Like, and it's, like, open bar, but I don't want, a gin and tonic. Like, cabs just... Like, there's always going to be a cab. There's always going to be a Sauvignon Blanc. There's always going to be a Chardonnay.
Yeah.
And, like, cabs just where I would go, but I don't buy cabs anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, we could do a wine one, too, because...
That'd be really fun at the end.
Yeah, that'd be really fun at the end. That'd be fun the whole podcast.
Right.
I'm a lightweight. I think by minute 15, I'd be like, ooh, this is some good.
I'm warm.
I'm giving this cab a 9.
We can do that, definitely. And especially now that we're meeting later. Because it would feel weird drinking wine. We used to meet at 9 a.m. for those who don't know. But I've recently taken to light therapy for my psoriasis, which, look at that. Like, I don't know if you... it's, like, completely gone.
Yeah.
So I stand in a light box for 2.5 minutes, and they blast me with UVB rays.
Yeah.
And it's cleared my skin, but I have to continue it. So we're now meeting at 11, and 11 is almost noon, so having a cab would not feel...
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Just a couple dudes on a podcast having having a Cabernet. We'd have to change the introduction.
While drinking Irish coffee.
While drinking. The end. And there's I'm sure there's plenty of podcasts out there like that.
My guess is there's probably beer ones, like two hipsters sitting down talking about how bitter their IPA is.
Who has the bitterest IPA?
Yeah,
it's like somebody brings in like a quintuple IPA. You're like, dude, why don't you just put a piece of straw in your mouth and chew on it for 2 hours? Anyway, we could do an episode on my beef with IPAs, and
I think we've talked about our beef with IPAs,
and yeah, I think we have.
Like, we're both over them,
and beer craft culture and all that kind of thing, but only because not because those beers are bad, just because like it's cliche.
Yeah.
And I used to be that guy, so now I hate that guy, right? That's how that works.
Right. So ethics.
Yeah, you pulled a twist on
Sorry.
me because I can kind of see like why most people in the modern age actually would look at philosophy and be like, is that even should that even be a thing? Does that need to be a thing?
Yeah.
But ethics is, and maybe you need to define what you mean by it. But when I think of ethics, I think of morality and why you should and shouldn't do certain things, which I think is something you would like believe in, that there are things we shouldn't do and things that we should do, and there's a right and wrong way to live life, which is even if you can't ground it in metaphysics or anything transcendent, I still think most people have an ethic that they go by.
So I guess what I'm thinking is like sort of the last episode is we were talking about Kierkegaard and Hume, and not Descartes. Who's the one who was Kierkegaard writing against
Kant.
Kant, right? Like trying to ground.
You should have said, "I can't remember."
And just say it in the high. I can't remember.
Yeah.
We're trying to ground like why you shouldn't murder, why you should give to charity in this logical, philosophical metaphysics framework. It's just I see no value or use in it at all. And so like thinking about bringing this topic up and how to flush it out, like we have this mistaken notion that things, and I'm sure you've heard it's like 50-50 nature nurture.
Yeah.
And this mistaken notion that you can train people on how to do things and this and when you actually get down to the statistics, it's so like the nurture component of behavior of individuals, like work ethic, morality, even is about 5 to 10% of what you can guide and steer. And so I think because Descartes and the Church, Catholic Church initially, have this like dualism, right? Where there's a mind and a body. And I think for the atheist, you're going to go to Descartes, and for the theological, you're going to go to Church, whether that the evangelical Church, right? And they wouldn't call it mind body, they call it soul body.
Sure.
Maybe you could get some sort of Trinitarians in there who think there's a mind, a soul, and a body, and the soul and the mind are distinct from each other, and the body is... and so because we have a dualism, and most people are, I think, dualists, at least in the West.
Yeah.
It probably breaks down a little bit in Eastern philosophy. A little bit. You think, like, you have the ability to control your thoughts in your brain. The ironic part is nobody's like, oh, just make yourself uglier, or give yourself bigger hips, or will yourself to be taller. Why? Because those are things that you inherited from your parents, right? Uh-huh. And at least my family has very strong genes. So when I was a kid, I can remember walking through even Boston and people stopping us and being like, "You're an O'Keefe, aren't you?"
Yeah.
And the reason they knew the O'Keefe name is my grandfather was kind of a big, like, not a big shot, but he started his own business. He was very charitable. He knew a lot of people. he had a lot of children. Like, I have 9 biological aunts and uncles, and then my grandfather adopted 6 more from my grandmother's brother. Like, so there was like 15 kids living in their house, all O'Keefe's. Yeah. We all look alike.
Yeah.
Right? There's like an O'Keefe look. You would not, like, my family gets in a room and people were like, yup. Like, I didn't choose what I look like. You didn't choose what you, like, you look like your parents who look like their grandparents with minor tweaks here and there. With, you know, so long as there's not some mutation, genetic mutation early on in the embryo, or something like you live next to a chemical facility and so now you have birth defects, right? But, you know, given the normal, stereotypical passing on of genes without pollutants or adverse mutations, people have essentially the genetic qualities of their parents physically. Yet for some reason, we think mentally that's not true.
Yeah. I mean, I've had my doubts about that because my youngest brother is adopted and didn't pick up many of what we would call like Miller ways of acting, and acted a lot like my mother would say that my adopted brother. Now, we adopted him from within the family, so that's probably important to explain here. Otherwise, this is going to sound weird. I don't want to belabor this point, actually, but he was my cousin's kid, but we adopted him into our family as our brother because my cousin wasn't able to take care of him, which means that he was biologically my
second cousin.
He was biologically my second cousin. He was my uncle's grandchild, biologically, but we called him our brother. Anyway, so my mother had become estranged from her brother, my uncle, his grandfather, but she would say he acts just like my brother when my brother was young. The two never met each other.
Yeah.
So just that, I've always, just from my own personal experience, sort of believed, like, I wouldn't know what the percentages between nature and nurture are, but it's certainly not 100, and I probably doubt it's 50-50. So far I'm tracking with what you're saying. I'll say this. How I would just ask, like, people can't change their genetics, I guess, but they can change their body. I could conceive of a world in which people could change their. That's probably beside the point. That's nitpicking. What you're saying is people's genetics are what they are,
and they're far more deterministic.
And they're far more determinist, not of just their physical qualities, but also of their personality and the way that
right. And we tend to think of them as only the physical traits that get passed down, right?
Yeah.
So, like, when you're at the doctor, like, say you were having chest pain, you go to the doctor, they're going to ask, like, is there a history of heart disease? Is there a history of this?
Yeah.
And to some extent, if you're going to a psychiatrist, they're probably, depending on what kind of study they are, but if they're behavioral psychiatrists, and every psychiatrist, when you go to their office, is going to ask, like, do you have a history of depression in your family, or bipolar, or schizophrenia, or, right? They're going to ask these because there's such a strong genetic link, like, because I have bipolar, it's a 50-50 chance that my kids are going to have bipolar, and we know that at least one does. I have 6 kids, so we're waiting for the other 3, right? Mm-hmm. And if someone with bipolar marries someone with bipolar and they both have a kid, you're damn near ensured that they're going to have bipolar.
Yeah.
Which is part of, quote-unquote, the mind.
Right.
Right? So the thought that we can change why something is right or wrong, or convince people, or that this mind is malleable and different. And I want, like I said, about 10% of traits. So, like, you're either smart or you're not. You're either a hard worker or you're not. There's very few people that can increase their intelligence through work and study. Like, you're going to score what you score on the SATs. You can teach people tricks on how to take tests, but at the end of the day, you can either do multivariable calculus or you can't.
Do you think there's a range and limits. Like, do you think? Because I think there's underachievers, right? Like, there are people that aren't.
Sure.
They could be this smart, but they haven't trained themselves to get to their max. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
Or they could be this athletic, but they haven't trained themselves to get.
I don't know. Like,
to that max. Like,
I think you're just athletic or you're not, and there's a genetic part called drive that might make you want to push yourself to be an Olympic athlete. But I would never become an Olympic athlete. Like my daughter Kiera, like, you know, bless her soul, she's the klutzy. Like she just can't do sports. She has lots of other great qualities, but balance and coordination are not one, and have never been one of them.
Yeah. So that personality trait there, the personality trait is not the athleticism. The personality trait would be drive.
Right. Because your body is either athletic or it's not.
So what I'm asking is, like, can you fall short of your max level? Is it possible to have more drive than you're currently acting out on? Or any sort of personality trait, just name any. Like, is it possible? I think it's possible for you to be smarter than you are. Although I will accept the idea that it's not possible to be as smart. It's not possible for every human being to be as smart as possible.
Right. Not everyone can be Stephen Hawking.
Right, but it is possible for every human being to be dumber than they could be.
Yeah, so the studies that I've seen, and I'll have to look them up, maybe put them in the show notes, is about 80 to 90% of intelligence is just genetic. There's nothing you can do. But there is that 10 to 20%. But that's a very low percentage, especially when we're thinking in the ethical, philosophical, like dualistic mind-body connection.
Yeah.
Right? And I think, like, one thing I want to go back to is like the twin studies where they've had twins separated at birth or like given up for adoption. Like these people, like they name their kids almost the same. They marry women like some of these people, like both of them were divorced 3 times. Their first wife looked like this. Their second wife looked like this. Their third, like just so much where they think this is free will. And you grab someone from across the country with no connection to their twin and you bring them together and their lives were identical, essentially. Like you could switch them out and nothing would have been different, even though one person's in New York and the other person's in LA.
Other than geography, yeah.
Right? So, like, and that includes, like, their morals, their religiosity. Like,
yeah.
So how then do we get to, like, ethics is something that should be pondered? Like, it's just something that is.
I think we're pondering ethics because you're talking about personality, but I think we really should be talking about choices.
But I guess what I would say is the science of choice is that you don't have them.
Well, at the very least, then they're illusory.
Or they're illusory. Or the choices that you have are infinitesimally small compared to, right? But we think, therefore we are, right? No, that's a terrible joke. We think that we're dualistic.
Yeah.
Right? And that your soul or your mind, when given a certain choice, can choose the other. And I think that is far less possible, especially the more we learn about genetics and behavioral psychology, than the vast majority of people think. So pondering ethics is sort of a futile exercise.
Well, let's do a thought experiment where we take ethics out of a basic mundane choice.
Okay.
You know, so should I have cereal that's going to rot my teeth and make me fat at 11 p.m. like I did last night? Or not?
Yeah.
And in the end, the multiverse, the genetic code, all of it combined to, like, I was never not in this universe going to eat that cereal.
Right.
Never. And, you know, but I can't be conscious of that. Because I don't know. That's kind of like, that will drive you insane. It's like Deadpool, right? Knowing that That he's a comic book character. And I've seen that theory. We're going back to comics book. I've seen that theory actually with the Joker. Is that the reason he's insane? Insane. I put in quotation marks. Is that he knows that he's a comic book character. And Batman doesn't know that he's a comic book character. So Joker knows that absolutely none of his actions matter in any real way. He knows that his world's a simulation. Mm-hmm. He knows that his world's not real. I think it's an impossible kind of existence for us to imagine at this state in our evolution, if not ever.
I think I'm there.
Okay.
Like, I mean, in some way, yes, when it comes to, I don't know what we're having for dinner yet. I'm going to go to the store. I'm going to see what looks good. And I'm going to, and in that sense, I'm going to believe I have a choice. But,
yeah. Does somebody know?
Well, I don't think it's does somebody know, because I think it's, how to think about this. The choices I'm going to make are predestined because of my genetic makeup.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So part of the reason you like cereal that makes you fat is, humans have evolved to really like sugar.
Uh-huh.
Because in the, 100, 200, a million, 2 million years ago, that meant, a really energy-dense food source that was going to help you survive. Mm-hmm. Right? And the reason why so many people struggle with, healthy foods is because your brain's not wired for it. If you have, regardless of what you're trying to do, if you're, paleo or keto or whatever, if you're in the wild and you're given the choice between a sugar cube and a piece of kale, you're going for the sugar cube.
Yeah. That's true on the, not to bring too much levity to the situation, but that bears out to be the truth in the show Survivor. People always give up $1 million for peanut butter. Always. It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
It's no willpower.
Willpower is an illusion.
Right, that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
But, alright, so I had a thought and then it left me. So, so people gain too much weight. They become overweight. They look at themselves in the mirror one day and they're like, I don't like myself. I need to go on a diet and work out.
Yeah.
And it doesn't happen very often, but it happens. So people lose, they lose 50 pounds or whatever. They gain the discipline to do what they didn't have the discipline to do before. Mm-hmm. It's complete reversal of, it's a life change. And so I'm not saying this disputes your point, but it's an interesting thing to think about, because then I think what you would be forced to say is that's predetermined too. So both in one point in their life, their lack of discipline was predetermined, but ultimately, if they lose the weight, that was predetermined too. And I don't know. So
first, before I get to the film,
so are they a disciplined?
Do you remember the show Biggest Loser?
Yeah.
Do you know how many people maintained their weight
after I doubt it's very many.
0.
Yeah.
Every single winner of the Biggest Loser regained their weight.
Right.
So that
okay. So people that have been
most people who diet,
people that have been sober for. There's people that got sober and stayed sober their whole lives. Right. It's rare, but it happens.
Yeah.
Most of the times people relapse, but sometimes people relapse and then they recover and then they relapse and then they recover and then when they die, they die sober.
Yeah.
So it's I don't know. There's change and unpredictability. If it's all determined, there's still change and unpredictability in the determined system.
So those people who become addicts, though, right?
Yeah.
They've had probably their father or mother was an addict,
sure.
right? So they're
sure.
There's people who, and like, I've done cocaine, right? Back in my college days. I was like, cool, that's fun, and walked away, right? There are people who, like, do a line of cocaine, and they're like, now I'm a cocaine addict.
So what does it mean for it to be predetermined for people to recover from addiction?
So I still think there's a genetic drive in your genes, right? The selfish gene to reproduce. The genes want to go on and live. And if you're under a bridge shooting up heroin,
right.
So there's a battle here between your body and your mind, both of which are, I would say, just body. But there's different genes. One is like, I want to continue getting high because I like the dopamine, and the other's like, well, when we're high, we can't reproduce as efficiently, we can't raise our young, so that, right? Like, very rarely is there an addict who's very happy that they're an addict, and the ones who are happy, like, they don't get sober.
Oh yeah,
right? They're like, this is great, I'm fine, it's fine.
I don't think I've ever met one, actually. I don't think I've ever met an addict who I believe genuinely was like, this is the life.
Right.
They may say that, but I've never believed it.
Right. So then there is this genetic imperative to, like, not do this thing.
Yeah.
But your brain gets hijacked a little bit. But again, your brain gets hijacked, right? By neurotransmitters having extra chemicals, namely serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, that tells your brain, this is like sugar, this will help you survive. And eventually that wears off and your brain's like, this isn't like sugar anymore. This is a hindrance to survival. But, like, there's no sort of spiritual aspect to taking heroin. It's just your brain got flooded with dopamine, which is usually a sign of, like, keep doing that. Right. So again, like, where does ethics and philosophy come in if it's all just, like, dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, avoidance of pain, and your genes trying to pass themselves on? Which I think, like, why do we not murder? Because we've evolved to be a communal species, and the best way to have the survival of our kin is to have a predisposition to not murder. Right? Like, chimpanzees don't need ethics to not murder within their clan. They will murder other clans, but so will humans. Right? It's the other that we're always fighting. It's why we don't care so much that there are people starving in Atreya, because we don't have people in it. Like, Atreya is not our in crowd. But if your family member was starving, you'd sure as crap do something about it.
Right.
So you don't really need this Kant, Hume, like, let's figure out why we shouldn't murder and ground it in rationality and logic. Like, I'm like, it doesn't need to be grounded. It's just it's a brute fact, right? And I know you don't like brute facts, but all worldviews have brute facts, right? Like, one of Kant's brute facts would be, you can reason and logic things. You can't logic that logic is logical, right? You just have to make the statement, like, logic is logical. Okay, that's the brute fact of that worldview. My brute fact is, like, people don't murder. It's just in our genes. There's no why. The why is because genetics tell us not to murder.
So then murder is an aberration, a genetic aberration.
Certain types. Like, there's murder for self-defense that I would also... Right? But like
serial killing. Like psychopathy.
Yes.
Like, it's basically the equivalent, you're saying, of a mutation.
Of not being born with a left hand. Right.
Huh. Okay. So this is a very different paradigm for me.
Now I didn't really flush this out so much, but
yeah.
I want to say that I'm not oh gosh,
You're not a hedonist or a nihilist or...
No.
Sorry. I'll let you...
It's okay.
I'm just trying to save us from radio silence. If it was not a podcast, I'd just sit here.
Yeah.
I don't want to put words in your mouth, but...
The people in the late 1800s, early 1900s who were like, well, we should sterilize people because we don't like their genes. Begins with an E.
I can't figure out. I can't think of the word either.
Right.
Yeah.
So like there were Supreme Court cases in the United States where, like a smaller court decided that this person they would call it mentally deficient, and that was such a like vague, open category that almost anyone could be determined mentally deficient, and then the courts had the legal right to castrate or give a hysterectomy so that these people couldn't reproduce. And some of them were completely normal people who just were like, today would call them like LARPers. Right? Sorry if you LARP, but I'm just saying like it was such a cloudy thing that they would just stop them from reproducing. Right, through medical procedure, and the Supreme Court still to this day says that's okay. That case, right? And I wouldn't go that far.
Yeah. Okay, but why?
Why wouldn't I?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
I say why, and with everything you're saying, the response that you give me to why is predetermined. Well, like you say, well, I don't know. Okay, that was predetermined. You don't.
So know. I guess the why would be like it would be very much in the. I'm going to sound very libertarian, but like, why shouldn't you murder? Why shouldn't you steal? Because it's not yours, right? So like, why shouldn't you sterilize someone who you feel is mentally deficient? Like, if we're gonna totally believe evolution, which is like one of the most verified scientific theories, then either our species is going to go towards mental deficiency, and there's a reason for that because we'll survive better in some niche, or that will like drown itself out. There's no need to drive sort of evolution and genetics. It's just going to happen on its own. So for me to go in and say, according to my standards, you feel mentally deficient, therefore I'm going to remove your testicles. Like that's...
Yeah. To me, this sounds a lot like the same debate that I would have if there were such a thing as deists.
What do you mean? Well, Jefferson was a deist, right?
Yeah, or even... And I'm trying not to bring it... I'll just do it. So, like, Calvinists... even when I was a card-carrying member, I wasn't like... I was not fully on board. I had questions.
You're a 4-point instead of...
I don't know. I never... I always had questions. And one of the things that would always come up with anybody, whenever somebody... It would be funny, because it seemed like nobody could actually believe... People that weren't Calvinists couldn't actually believe that there were Calvinists, like people who believed that God had predetermined who would be saved and who wouldn't. And you tell that to people who weren't versed in theology, and their first question inevitably would be, then why evangelize? Inevitably. Well, why evangelize?
Well, because you can't know who's predetermined, and evangelism is the tool by which God predetermined who is gonna...
Right. And if you don't evangelize, that was predetermined. That was part of the... So, going back to like deism, which my understanding of what deism is it's the idea that there was a watchmaker essentially who made the watch, and then now it runs in all the ways that he designed it to run. Which begs the question, who cares about the watchmaker then?
Well, I don't think deists actually worship the watchmaker. I think they're just like, there was a guy who created, or lady who created stuff, and that's that. Right? That's the answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? They're like, a deity did it.
I mean, then it doesn't matter. Then what matters is the watch. And the way that the watch works. Mm-hmm. And understanding how the watch works. So, I'm sort of on board with that. Like, I don't think it's ethical to live in a world where you're willfully, to use that term again, not willfully deluded. You're willfully ignorant. Like you're willfully like, I'm just not going to learn more about my world. I'm just not going to learn more about how it works. I'm just not going to learn about the biology or the electrons. I'm just not going to discover anything. I just think that's not the way to be. But like, as you discover those things, and those things begin to tear down previous explanations, whether those explanations were scientific or spiritual or whatever they were, you discover things, and your prior explanations be proven not to be able to actually explain the phenomena that you're seeing and observing. First of all, you never know when that process is going to end, and secondly, I still come up against, to me, the irony in what you're saying is, I can't escape the fact that saying no ethics, and maybe you're just talking about ethics as a general study. But so like, I can get on board with, I don't know what we're doing. I maybe we shouldn't be requiring students to go in debt to study an abstraction that may not actually serve them in any practical way.
Yeah.
Like the conversation about ethics and philosophy. But I feel like ethics comes down to me at 11 p.m. with a temptation to eat a bowl of cereal, and whether or not I'm going to do it. And whether or not I'm going to do it, and whether or not it's determined, is as irrelevant as whether or not there's a watchmaker. I'm still there in that moment, aware of, conscious of my existence, and conscious that my choices have consequences. Whether I'm ultimately in control of them or not is not going to be a determining factor for me and why I make a choice or don't.
Right. So I guess what I would reply to is, yes, I think that my statement that ethics and philosophy don't matter is more, why are we requiring? Well, first, let me go back to like, people aren't curious, or like they're not.
Yeah.
I think people are actually naturally curious. Some tend towards particle physics. Some tend toward asking these ethical questions. But everybody, right? Like, they're either curious about what's going to happen in the next TV show, or, like, what happens when I push, like right? Like, a bomb-ass car mechanic, they got there because they were curious about how gearboxes work.
Yeah.
Right? So humans are just naturally curious creatures, which is how we've, like, invented all these things. People are like, I wonder what happens when I rub this rock against a stone. Oh, it gets sharp.
Yeah.
Right? But, so I think I'm more talking, like, as we've started delving into philosophy and thinking about Kant, and maybe maybe Kierkegaard actually falls more with me as a nihilist, where it's like, why try to figure out a reason, a logical system of why you shouldn't murder, and just be like, people just don't murder, like, on average.
Right.
It's just not something we do. And like you don't, like, a 5-year-old isn't like, oh, here's a metaphysical like structure for me to understand that I shouldn't stab my brother in the eye.
Right.
They just sort of instinctually know.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's probably not true for 2 and 3-year-olds if you've had they're like, I'm going to hit you now, and you're like, dude, knock it off. But at some point they realize, like, I shouldn't just hit you with a hammer.
Yeah. And the danger of that is, do you know how easy it would be to ground like the ethics of why it's right and solid and good and better to hit your brother in logic and rationality?
Yeah.
That's how easy to manipulate. I mean, that's there's lots of ways to interpret Nietzsche, but I think that was one of his big insights. It's like, okay, if we're gonna do this project where we think we can actually ground ethics and morality in reason, what if I just change the ethics?
Right.
And ground it in a different reason?
Yeah.
the will to power, because that's actually more primal
Right.
than the will to be kind or
Maybe. I think that could go either way.
yeah, and
Right.
that's the debate people are having with Nietzscheans nowadays. Is like, is that actually true?
Right.
Is the will to power the actual thing? My point is that it's actually you haven't actually grounded. You can't ground particularly Christian ethics in. Ultimately, you can't ground it in reason, because someone like Nietzsche could come along and just go, Christian ethics sucks. You're like, but it does, and like, prove it. And like, I could, Nietzsche's like, I'm free to hit a guy rather than turn the other cheek.
Yeah.
And look how I can ground that in pre-Christian ethics, because you can. So I think we're on board with that. Actually, I think we're on the same page there. I just where was I going with this?
No.
You wouldn't have any idea. I'm just asking myself. I don't know. I don't know where I was going with that.
Yeah, I mean, I caught both of us off guard because I was actually thinking about this on my drive back from light therapy.
Yeah.
Well, it was like we did talk about it last week because I was like, I think it's all just BS.
Yeah.
Like it is grounded in behavioral psychology.
Uh-huh.
I think it is. I think Skinner would be like my go-to philosopher for human behavior.
Yeah.
And I think maybe a Sagan, a Feynman, or a. I'm losing everything today.
Yeah. I remember what I was going to say now.
Okay.
I was going to make an observation about how I preach, and it may be a subconscious choice, but I never stand up there and go, all right, here's what's morally correct. Here's what's morally incorrect. And here's why you should do the right thing. And here's why you shouldn't do the wrong thing. Because the Bible says you shouldn't do this. Or the Bible says you have to do this. Or, and nor do I preach a sermon that sounds anything like, the Bible says you should do this and you can ground it in reason, so double sword, you should always do this or you should never do this. Yeah. I wonder, like, I do think secular people might think that's what sermons are.
I mean,
are like moral instruction.
I think that's a lot of sermons.
And I don't, maybe that's how people take what I'm saying, but I don't view a sermon as that. Actually, what I view it as is trying to use the Bible to say things in such a way, whereas the people that are listening are hearing something that's transcendent and makes the next 7 days bearable and meaningful. That's honestly what I think I'm doing. And
I don't think you've been to enough fundamentalist independent Baptist churches in the South.
I've been to enough. That's the point.
Right.
I've been
But
to
I think
enough.
those places, they do feel like their job is to correct morality.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I was naive to that for a long time, but that's what actually was happening. It's only a couple years ago that I began to take a step back and go, this isn't grace. I thought these people really believed in grace.
Yeah.
Nate, and my understanding of what grace was God loves you no matter what. No matter what.
Yeah.
Like, if you're a psychopath and you kill people, like, you're not lost. That's when I was a Calvinist and a conservative Christian. That's what I thought we were preaching. I'm not so sure that's what everybody's preaching.
I don't know how I got onto this topic.
Yeah.
I think that's the initial preaching to someone who's not saved.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But the second
Yeah.
you're saved, it's now like, okay, you were lost, so it was okay to do X, Y, and Z. But now you're not.
It.
So
Yeah.
Right. So clean up your act. Right? Like, use your willpower.
Or you're lost again. Right?
Yeah.
So ultimately, it didn't matter that God loves you. What matters is whether or not you're sleeping with somebody you're not married to or whatever.
Yeah.
That's really what matters. And I think that didn't dawn on me until...
You can't be salt and light unless you're living
right
perfectly.
Which it's like that's self-defeating if either you weren't preaching grace to begin with, which I suspect is more the case, or it's selective. But my point in bringing that up, I didn't mean to get on a rabbit trail. The point in bringing it up is that I think we agree that trying to have an academic discussion or lesson about ethics, to write a book about it, or to give a lecture on it, or to have a whole philosophy surrounding it is maybe a waste of time. But we're still faced with these individual choices, and in those individual choices we're conscious of our own being and our own relationship to those choices and the consequences that those choices may or may not bear. Eventually we will be aware of those consequences. And so we still make choices, and we still, even if it's a matrix situation and we live in a simulation and it's all delusion, we're still under the impression that we're making those choices. And so there are still places for people like me, pastors, therapists, counselors, to help guide people in making better decisions than they might otherwise make, or to give something to feed them something other than nihilism. Not because nihilism may not be the truth, but because whether it's true or not, it's still destructive. And survival's not the worst thing.
I mean, so we're running up against the clock. And I think if we're going to get pushback, it's that I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, right? Because I'm like, we shouldn't euthanize people. That's what it is. Also, like...
Oh, I got you. That's not what I was thinking.
So, no.
I was thinking eugenics.
Yes. That. Also shouldn't euthanize people.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. I had to go back and remember that word, and now I lost my thought. I'm talking out both sides of my mouth. So I would say, because you're saying, people have choices. I strongly believe they don't. And this goes back to, I think, the idea that there's a mind and a body, and they're two distinct things. That's the mind. The idea of a choice is still rooted in this mind as this separate entity from the body, right? Because you don't have a choice in what you feel on your skin or how something tastes to you. Genetically, you either like cilantro or you don't, right? Either it tastes like soap or it tastes delicious. You can't make yourself like cilantro. So it might not be true anymore with modern MRIs and medical advances, but if you go back 20 years and you look at how they did brain surgery that open up your head, and then there's not like when you look at a diagram of a brain, they're like, here's the prefrontal cortex and here's the pituitary gland and here's the brainstem, right? Those lines don't exist in your actual brain. So the way they would figure out what's what is they would literally pinch parts of your brain, and they'd be like, all right, count back from 10, and the person would be like 10, 9, because they hit their speech center. Or people with tumors, their whole ethics and morality changes, right? You can have this super kind, gentle guy, and all of a sudden, after 6 months, he's beating people and just angry and sleeping around, and they're like, we don't know what happened to him. They think trauma, and then they do a PET scan, and it's oh, he's got a giant tumor, and they take the tumor out, and he returns back to how he is, right? So he didn't choose to become violent. He didn't choose to change his ways. It turns out there was something pushing against a certain part of his brain. So I think that's that's all. The brain is just a piece. It's just an organ, and your thoughts are just how that organ functions. I don't know. So I would say there's that for me that means there's not choice. Okay. Matt's just nodding along, looking at me like I'm insane.
I'm just glad that we, after years of talking about it, finally didn't choose to do this podcast.
Have a great week, everyone.